So let's begin with the presentation, argument analysis speech, the checklist. Now, the first set of checklist, students, is related to the content of the speech that you are making. What kind of content you are going to prepare? Content for the speech. So the first thing that the content of your speech should have in it is a thesis, a strong thesis, a clear thesis about the editorial on which you are going to speak. I hope by now you know that a thesis is your broader opinion about that particular piece. So you might say that the arguments in this editorial are strong enough to support the claim that the writer has. Or you might say that the arguments in this piece are too weak to support the claim that the writer has. But a very clear thesis that you have about the piece that you are going to analyze during your speech. A broader opinion about the piece. What is that opinion that you have? It is a must for your speech. Second thing that you should have in your speech is your analysis of the arguments. So when you read an editorial or when you read an opinion piece, you will come across a variety of information. There could be some facts, there could be some details about whatever the writer is writing about, but you need to stay focused on just the arguments. What argument does the writer has? In other words, what claim the writer is making and how the writer is supporting those claims with the help of evidence or with the help of reasons. So basically what you do is, right in the beginning of your speech, after a strong thesis, you summarize all the major arguments so that your reader, your audience knows what is that article about which you are going to analyze in front of them. So if you recall the Guardian article about the climate change, which we discussed, for a couple of times, you might say right in the beginning that the article about climate change, titled "Climate Change is a Myth," claims that there is no scientific foundation for climate change, and therefore climate change is a myth. And then you are required to summarize the arguments. You might say, in the process of summarizing the arguments, you might say that this writer has given a number of arguments. The writer argues that sea levels are rising or not rising, or the writer argues that ice is not melting, or the writer argues that there is no shortage of food because of weather changes, or the writer argues that there are no major weather related incidents like hurricanes or tornadoes. So in the summary of your arguments, you briefly describe each argument, but do not go into their details right in the beginning. After a strong thesis, you summarize all the arguments. I would say 2 sentences for all the arguments are enough. Just name them as I just named them. Just name those arguments. That the writer uses the arguments related to rising oceans, melting ice, changing weathers, food shortage, like that. This much is enough for you to summarize the arguments. So the thesis statement should be in the content, and then summary of the major arguments should be in the content. What after that? After that, you need to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of those arguments. So after giving the summary, you then pick each argument one by one and give your solid opinion about the quality of that particular argument. How will you do that? You will do that using the Tolman method. So you already would have done that work. That is, you have prepared your Tolman worksheet in light of the piece on which you are going to speak during your speech. So you know what is the weakness or strength in one particular argument. So you might say, if you are going to analyze the argument related to the rising oceans, where the writer of that article, which I'm referring to, the writer of that article says that had the oceans been rising, we must have been drowned. So that is his argument. So you might say, using the Tolman method, that this is a weak argument because the writer does not quote any verifiable data to support his argument or to support his claim. This way, you have to comment on each argument, evaluating the quality of each argument. So you can use the words like, there is no evidence in this argument, or you might say there is no data to support this claim, or you might say there is no verifiable reason given to support this claim, things of that kind. All those words that you come across in the Tolman method, you need to use all those words or some of those words for each argument while commenting on the quality of that particular argument. And when you do that, it is very important that you do not just say in general terms that this argument is weak because of this reason, or this argument is strong because of this reason. Rather, you should also use the material from that argument to support what you are saying. So the way I just described in front of you, the argument from that particular article, the writer says that had the oceans been rising, the world must have been drowned by now. For that particular argument, my evaluation can be that this is a weak argument, because when the writer says, had the oceans been rising, the world must have been drowned by now, the writer does not produce or introduce or give any scientific data to support his claim. Now, the way I have analyzed this argument, I have included the material from the editorial to make my comment. All right. So when you analyze the argument, use the material from the editorial so that your reader clearly knows, your audience clearly knows what is the weakness in the argument. Your audience clearly knows what is the argument and what is the weakness in that argument, or what is the argument and what is the strength in that argument, whatever the case is. And finally, use the visual aid. The visual aid for you people would be the Tolman worksheet. So you should prepare your Tolman worksheet in light of the editorial that you are going to analyze. And you will email that Tolman worksheet to me before your class on Thursday. And I will display that worksheet right on the screen for everybody. That worksheet will serve as a visual aid for your audience, basically. They will be able to better understand your explanation and your analysis of the argument if they have something to see about that on the slide. So this is about the content. In the content, you need to make sure that you have a strong thesis about the editorial on which you are speaking, and you stay focused on the arguments, and you give a summary of the argument right in the beginning of your speech, and then you evaluate the speech using the Tolman method, and you use the material from the editorial or the opinion piece itself, and finally you must use a visual aid in the form of the Tolman method worksheet. Now let's move on to the second set of checklist or second set of points related to the speech. The second set is about organization. How will you organize your speech? Now, one good way to maintain good organization in your speech is to give a preview statement about your speech in terms of how your speech will develop. So right in the beginning of the speech, you can tell your audience that today I'm going to analyze the arguments in an editorial titled "Climate Change is a Myth," published in The Guardian. I will first give my thesis statement, then I will summarize the arguments in that editorial, and after that I will evaluate the arguments using the Tolman method, and finally I will give a concluding statement. Now, this kind of statement that I have just spoken for you people, this is called a preview statement. This kind of statement gives a plan to your audience. Now they know what they should expect from you. So you have given a kind of plan to them that this is how I'm going to proceed in my speech. And your audience will be better able to follow your argument. So begin with a preview statement. That helps in organization. And while you move from one point in your speech to the other point in your speech, maintain a very smooth flow. How will you do that? I'll explain it further in this slide in the last 2 points. But the benefit of this smooth flow from one point to another is that you will avoid self-repetition. If you do not really plan how you are going to move from point 1 to point 2 and from point 2 to point 3, then there are always chances that you will keep repeating the points that you have already said. But if you have pre-planned your speech and you know that this is the first point you will speak and this is the second one, this is the third one, then there will be very less chances for you to repeat yourself. And repetition does not have a good impact on your speech. Now, when you move from one point to the other point, make sure that every new point that you begin, it should have its own topic sentence, so that your audience should know what is it that you are going to begin with now in this part of your speech. For example, you spoke your thesis statement, which is a general statement about the quality of the arguments in that particular editorial. You might say that this editorial presents strong arguments to support the claim that climate change is a reality. This is your thesis statement. And now you want to move on to the second point, and your second point is about summarizing the arguments. So after the thesis statement, then you should say something like this: now I will summarize the arguments, or now I will explain to you what are the major arguments in the speech. Or you can simply say, let me also tell you. You can say something like this: let me tell you right in the beginning what are the major arguments in the speech, in the editorial. Now this statement, let me tell you what are the main arguments in this editorial, that becomes a topic sentence. Why? Because that is exactly what you are going to do right after this statement, which is you are now going to number those arguments. So then you can say that the arguments in the editorial are related to the rising oceans, melting ice, weather changes, food shortage, and so on, so forth. So take care that for every new part that you begin in your speech, it should begin with a topic sentence. That will help you to smoothly transit between the sections of your speech. It is also useful to use some signposts to move smoothly between the sections of your speech. Again, signposts are those words which help your audience to understand that now you are going to take a turn, or now you are going to move on to the next point. I'm sure you can imagine the signposts on road. What do signposts tell you? They kind of warn you about a turn which is coming up, or they warn you about an underpass which is ahead of you, or they might warn you of a slope on the road ahead of you. And then you get prepared to handle that. Similarly, you need to set some signposts for your audience so that they know what kind of turn that you are going to take in your speech. So after you have spoken thesis statement and you are going to summarize your arguments now, there should be some signpost for your audience to know that your thesis statement is done, and now you are going to describe a summary of your arguments. And when you move from the summary of the arguments to the analysis of the arguments, once again, you should use some expression to indicate this to the audience that now you are going to analyze the arguments in your speech. So those signposts can be some transitional words. For example, after you have summarized your arguments, you might say, now I will analyze the arguments using the Tolman method. Now, in this statement, the word now is a kind of transition. And your audience will get this point that you are done with one part and you are moving to the other part. Now I will. So the word now becomes a kind of signpost for the audience. Or you can use other expressions as well. You might say, after that, or after this explanation, or after this summary, now I will analyze the arguments in the editorial. Or there are other words as well. For example, if you are on the last part of your speech, you might say, I would like to conclude my speech. Now the word conclude becomes a signpost. Your audience will immediately know you are at the conclusion now, and you will finish your speech. Okay. Right in the beginning of the speech, you might say, let me begin by giving you a plan for my speech, or by giving you a preview of my speech. So let me begin, those three words tell your audience that you have started your speech. Okay. So be aware of, the signposts that you should insert here and there between the sections of your speech. If you are analyzing 4 arguments in your speech, for example, do not just start the analysis and keep speaking without any break unless you finish your analysis. Rather, introduce signposts between the arguments as well. So after you are done with analysis of one argument, you might say, another argument that this author gives is this. Now the word another, that becomes a signpost. That means you are done with one part and you are moving to the other part. That will make it much easier for your audience to understand and follow your analysis of the editorial or opinion piece that you are focusing on. So this is about the organization, students. In order to organize your speech very well, you should give a preview statement of your speech, and then you should move very smoothly from one point to another point in your speech so that you can avoid repetition in your speech. Begin each part of your speech with a topic sentence and keep your transitions very smooth. In order to make your transition smooth, you should use signposts while moving from one point in your speech to the other point in your speech, or while moving from one section of the speech to the other section of your speech. Now let's move on to the third set of instructions, or third set of points related to argument analysis speech. And that part is called delivery of the speech. Now, these are the things that you need to keep in mind while delivering your speech. The first one, use minimum notes for your speech. For the argument analysis speech, students, you are not supposed to read from notes. You are supposed to present your speech with as less notes as possible. You have read the editorial. You have written your analysis of the editorial and your analysis of the arguments in the editorial with reference to the Tolman method. You have written sentence outline. You have written keyword outline. After all that, you don't need to look at the notes. So as less as possible. Maintain an appropriate posture. So stay confident, stand upright. A lazy, lethargic posture will give this impression to your audience that you are not much passionate about that particular topic. On the other hand, if you are passionate about the topic on which you are speaking, your audience will also get passionate about it. And that will enhance their interest in the topic on which you are speaking. So maintain a confident, exciting, passionate posture for your audience. Do not stand motionless. Gestures contribute to communication. Therefore, use appropriate, effective gestures during your speech. Maintain eye contact. 70 to 80% of the total speech time, you should maintain eye contact with the audience. One important caution is, do not look at the visual aid excessively. So you will have your Tolman method worksheet displayed for the audience on the screen. You might have the same thing in front of you in your computer as well. Now you have to look at the audience, not at the visual aid. Visual aid is not for you, it is for the audience. So make sure that you maintain your eye contact with the audience and do not look too much on the visual aid. I mean, it is fine to look at it, here and there, but do not look at it constantly. Keep the verbal fillers to a minimum. Verbal fillers are those meaningless words that we use in our speech just to fill the gaps in our speech. Okay, so the words like you might say, it looks like, or in all likelihood. Okay, the expressions like that, they are just used to fill the pauses and gaps in our speech. Avoid those fillers. And finally, the volume and rate of your speech. Maintain a volume which is neither too loud or not too low. It should not be too loud that it is irritating for the audience, but at the same time, it shouldn't be too low that it is not audible for the audience. And then the rate of the speech, neither speak too fast nor speak too slow, so that your audience fully gets what you are saying. If you are at a kind of medium speech rate, but if your speech rate is too low, then you will be just wasting your audience time. So for the delivery, these are the things, students, that you have to keep in your mind. Use your notes minimally, maintain a confident, exciting, upright posture, use gestures as much as you can, which are engaging, maintain eye contact with the audience, do not look at the visual aid too much, do not use much verbal fillers, and maintain a reasonable volume and rate of your speech. Final thing, it is about deduction of grade or marks in your speech. The full sentence outline as well as the keyword outline, both are required. So if you miss any one outline, you might lose 1 point per outline. And the second thing is about the time penalties. The duration of the speech is 3 to 4 minutes. So if it is 15 minutes less than 3 minutes, you might lose 1 point. And if it is 15 minutes above 4 minutes, if it is 15 seconds below 3 minutes, then you might lose 1 point. And if it is 15 seconds above 4 minutes, again, you might lose 1 point. So 1 point loss per 15-second violation. Okay, either above 4 minutes or below 3 minutes. Between 3 to 4 minutes is perfect. So students, this is all for the presentation.